Welcome to Cancer and Peace. My name is Sean Stewart. I'm here with my good friend Peter Scalzo on his 18-year cancer journey, and we're going to talk another topic today. And, I think what I found is we tend to talk about, hey, what's going on in our own lives a bit. And when we were talking about subjects and direction a little bit, a bit of personal experience was something, I guess, just a direction I was going from. And when we talked about this, you related. And there's a concept, and I'm going to put it out there that we kicked around, and it is, and it's a biblical concept, but it's a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And so you and I were talking about this, and it kind of resonated with you also. And so our thoughts today are just to talk about the importance of being wholehearted. And where it is your focus. And it was my belief, and this is where I wanted to point back to you, is that cancer was a journey that generally pointed people into wholeheartedness, into what was really important. And so I wanted to just talk about your experience with that, and is that a true thing? What are your experiences in how it's changed your focus?
Yeah, I think that passage in James too, I didn't read it before our podcast, but I think the image is of like an ocean and being tossed to and fro, and instability if you're double-minded versus if you're single-minded or wholehearted. I think that the picture I get is of an anchor holding that ship in place, even though the waves are going all over the place. And I think for me, that's what I think of when I think of a cancer journey. I think of a diagnosis and decisions regarding treatment, surgery, all that as the storm. There's a storm, and we call it the wall, the storm. But and so I think that it's like anything like that, which causes that kind of disruption in your life. It's like, at least for me, it was, where does my focus need to be on? What do I really believe? I mean, that was a big thing. What do I think about my relationship with God and all that sort of this? And, at the time, when I was diagnosed, initially, busy attorney, 6 children, busy in church, busy community, busy, son, brother, all that stuff. And it was, I don't know if it's like one of those pictures of a person where all of a sudden just one thing comes into focus. And you're like, all this other stuff goes away. And it's like, hold on, I've got a life-threatening diagnosis right now. And what does that mean? And so I think is that sort of what you were thinking of with the single-mindedness?
I'll put some meat on the bone too, just to add to that, because I like what you're saying, because I think that's right.
Yeah.
And then the way I was thinking about this, I'll talk about my personal experience in a second, but just to put something more, in the theoretical space out there, we've talked a lot about narrative, and it's as if you're trying to live two competing narratives. And narratives, I'll redefine it. The definition I like to use here is narrative is the story you live your life by. And so if you have two competing stories that you're living your life by, that's why you be pulled or unstable in all your ways, is because sometimes one story is taking precedence and it has you moving and running in one direction, and then your focus changes to the other narrative, and then you're running and moving everything to that direction. And so you become unstable in that it's hard to even know like up from down when you're living to competing narratives. And so wholeheartedness and understanding your narrative and what's really important is kind of a little bit what I was going to. And I really felt like, and so you're defining that, it says you had all these things going on in your life and they felt like they had a level of importance. And then cancer comes along and you recognize life from a lens, a story that has much more of a singular focus than ever before, I think is what you said. Does that resonate?
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's important to really take time to understand whether or not you're double-minded or not, or unstable. And so my personal experience, and this is just even the last few days, in every life, you kind of go through real highs and lows. And in my life, I had run into this dry season, this period where it just felt like God was distant and things had slowed way down in just the growth space. And as I kind of just kept muddling forward, something that played along with that is that my disciplines, my spiritual disciplines, my practice of intimacy with God were being diverted. They were being pulled in other ways. And I got more and more focused on what was happening in the broader world around me, things that were out of my control. And the more I got focused on those things to, in a sense, distract me. So because I was feeling that dryness, I was basically looking for stories or storylines that would engage me in some way. And it was a way of just being distracted of that feeling of dryness, of lack of growth, of things just slowing down to a bit of a crawl. And what happened was that became in itself self-fulfilling. It's as if the more I spent time in this other narrative, in what's going on in the broader world, in news stories and in politics and everything else that's happening out there, I found that I was double-minded. I was focused on things that weren't important to my real world and things that I had no control over. And that was causing me to become more and more depressed and isolated, and a sense of hopelessness, because it is hopeless. I have no ability to control that or even engage in that. And so I say that is that the moment that came to clarity, I recognized that my issue was double-mindedness, that I wanted to have a foot in this world to be able to engage in that and to live in that narrative and have an and Jesus mentality or an and God mentality. It's like, yeah, I'm still living a God life and all the things in that relationship, but I want to have this too. And I want to dabble over here in such a way that it was a competing force for time and intimacy with God. And so, of course, things are going to slow down and become drier and less meaningful when my focus is pointed in a different direction. And so I'll point this in relational ways. Like when my relational focus tries to manage two competing major narrative relationships that I have in my life, one of those is going to suffer, or both. And so it's kind of the direction I'm. So it's kind of like the how it's played out in my life and how it plays out in why this concept is so important. And so does that resonate with you, or does that make sense?
Yeah, just some follow-up questions. So the person who's working a job, who's focused on their career, that kind of thing, how would you label that, in context of what we're talking about?
Yeah, so it's not that there's no issue with the job, and there's no, I think the point that is, do they have a competing narrative about what's important, though?
Okay.
And so it is having a job to sustain yourself, but let's say that you're saying to yourself, hey, I'm going to get my fulfillment from my relationship with Christ. And then you say, and you may not say this, but you're the way you live your life is like you're striving to get fulfillment at the same level from your job. And so we talk about it in recovery a lot. It's like this, is your value coming based upon your performance or what you do, or is your value a value that's been given to you innately by God? And so
it's kind of like the, I'd like the teaching Jesus used of having two masters, God and money.
Yes.
And you can't serve both.
That's exactly what we're talking about. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think this is, for me, it happened so subconsciously that I had moved into having a double-minded spirit and pursuits that were happening in two spheres. And it meant that, and you see this concept is like one of the one of the woes to the seven churches was you've lost your first love. And so I think the understanding of what is your first love is probably a way of answering your question is like, hey, can you have career? Can you have family? Can you have all these things and still be on a journey of intimacy with God and others? And the answer is you can have that, but what's your first love? What sets your priorities? What and that's the thing that I think would be clear is like what sets your priorities?
Yeah, and I think that's helpful, Sean. And now I sort of understand in the context of a cancer journey that it's one of those storms or walls in life that sort of forces you into a narrative of, what really is important, what is life all about.
It's a priority setting.
Yes, where am I going when I die? What is faith about? Is there a higher power? Those kinds of, because those are really threshold narrative questions. And I think most people who are diagnosed with cancer have those questions, wonder that. And they may never have been put into that position but for the cancer. And so in that sense, I get what you're saying as far as and how if you have two competing narratives, how you would be unstable and just your reactions to things, your pursuit of things, everything. And a double-minded person, is unstable in all his ways is what the scripture says. Yeah. So I get that.
Yeah. I think to carry the point then a little bit out is, and one of the most important reasons for doing this, sometimes we live in the subconscious. And the reason why I think it's great to have as a topic out here today is to recognize that the cancer journey is probably an invitation to examine your narrative and to let it be a priority setting experience. And you may come to a different, the person that's listening to this may come to a different conclusion than what you and I would about what their priorities are.
Right.
But there's great peace in knowing what is your priority and what's most important, and then having that focus so that you're not double-minded. I think that has a lot of significance to it. And by having a conscious conversation about it and recognizing it can be really important, because we've talked about inventory here before.
Yeah.
A bit. And so this is another way of just approaching that. Cancer is a tool that can help you to realize the importance of taking an inventory. Where is my life going? What is important?
Yeah.
And do I have a priority?
Yeah.
And then the next question is, if I say I have a priority and I examine it, am I actually living that priority as the way I believe that's what I want to have as my priority?
Yes.
And so I don't know, maybe you've had the experience of, I know I have, and I'll bounce this. Have you had the experience of having a said priority, but when you looked at your life, you recognized that your said priority, your stated priority, doesn't match your lived priority?
Yeah. Tell me about your life with that.
I think what would happen in the past is somebody would say, hey, what's the most important priorities related to, if you were to list out, God, family, work. I think what I found was that in inventory is that I was a workaholic. I wouldn't have put work as my highest priority, but as a workaholic, I was trying to get all my value out of performance in a job role, and family and my experience and my relationship with God were clearly in the back seat. I would state a different priority when asked,
right?
But my life, where I spent my time, energy, and even where I found that I was able to cover up my insecurities came in that job space.
Yeah.
And so I'd become heavily reliant on career as my way of finding value. But I wouldn't have said that if somebody would ask me straight out.
It just reminds me of, when we were quoting the pastor who spoke at the luncheon and about the wall moment.
Yes.
The person you think you are comes into collision with the person you really are.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like
yes.
It's this moment where it's like, oh, this is who I really am.
Yeah,
and
your
this
real
is my
self
real narrative.
catches up with your false self.
Yeah,
That
you're
is
right.
such a
Yeah.
great concept. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, it's hard. I think this is a difficult discussion. It's not a difficult discussion, but practically speaking, it's not easy because life is hard. And as I'm just going to speak as a father and as I was a husband and just a man provider. I have 6 children and all that. My penchant for being performance based and getting my value from that was something drilled into me from my family of origin since I was a little boy on up, and common for our culture, right? Especially my Italian culture and having a business in the family and then going to law school, and everything was about image and performance and accolades and all that stuff, And then after my 14th surgery, when it became metastatic 2 years later, I was told to go on disability. And I was thinking about that because I stopped performing the practice to make money. I was on disability. And I thought, well, where's my value going to come from? And it was one of those surreal moments in life where it's like, hold on, I'm going to die. But it was also a huge gift because I remember honing in on asking myself the question intentionally, Peter, what's really important in your life? Who are you really? And I found out that I really wanted an intimate, dependent relationship with Jesus. That was very important to me. That was a high value. But also, I wanted to strengthen my relationship with my children. And I wanted to leave a legacy. I wanted to leave something significant. And so that changed my narrative about things I owned. I didn't care anymore about a big house or cars or all that.
Or many sets of clothes.
Yeah. Yeah, many sets of clothes. If you're watching, you notice we haven't filmed all these episodes in one sitting. We're on our 52nd, whatever it is, episode. Yeah. But I tend to wear the same things. This is my Wednesday outfit. And maybe it's my Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday outfit too. I don't know.
Peter is now a minimalist, which is pretty cool, actually.
I am a minimalist. But, I think about my priorities and my narrative, and it was totally honed by the cancer journey. Totally honed by that. And I'm thankful for that.
Yes, I think that's why this is not a podcast for just to beat people down. It's actually a recognition that there has been a great benefit out of having a wholehearted, like you having your heart aligned to wholeheartedness as to what's really important has been a real benefit to you. But it is not easy either to make that transition, I think.
Yeah.
I think my experience, and I think yours also, is that it's not an overnight experience usually. It actually takes a while to do that examination and to understand and to admit where your priorities were at and the misalignment of those, because that's why we call it a moral inventory or an honest inventory, is that you have to be honest about, I said my priorities were with God, but if you look at my life, they didn't reflect that.
Right.
Or with my family, well, they didn't reflect that.
Right.
And the moment that moral inventory, you get to that understanding, then there's a process to re-engage. And re-engagement is not a flip of a switch, and it's not a 15-minute exercise where I'm now re-engaged. It is a lifestyle of changes and new understanding.
And what this reminds me of, Sean, and I forget where I heard it, you probably know, but this great value of accepting reality. I mean, that to me has been a huge journey. It started in recovery 9-10 years ago. It's gone through the cancer space into where it's now, but just accepting reality. That's where a lot of my growth has happened. My narrative came out of that. You know what I'm saying? And I forget do you remember where that comes from? I guess a lot of podcasts say it, but.
Yeah, there's probably a lot to be
Yeah.
thought about there. So I don't have a direct in that, because it is, when you learn to accept reality, it's one of those concepts around grieving.
Yes.
So it's like when we start thinking
huge.
about grieving, they have these stages of grieving, and the last one is to start living your life in reality.
Yes.
And accepting the gift of reality as it is today, that there's opportunity that comes out of that.
Reality. Yeah.
And so in that sense, and we have talked about the grieving process is a bit of walking from through those cycles of, and a bit of, in some ways, which I think is what living in a duplistic type lifestyle is, living in insanity. It's because you can't live two narratives that are competing narratives simultaneously without kind of living a form of insanity, because they are competing. And
I know all about insanity.
Well, and I like to think about this, and you and I talked about this beforehand.
Yeah.
Before we started this recording, it was to think of it relationally.
Yeah.
In wholeheartedness is, because it could easily turn into just like a religious type of exercise. But to think about this relationally, it'd be similar to trying to have two primary relationships in your life, or as a spouse. And I think, you're going to, in the Bible, it talks about you're going to love one master and hate the other.
Right.
And I think it's impossible to have a divided relationship and not have it cause some level of degradation, or it's going to hinder. So in other words, if I'm married with my wife and I say, hey, you're the focus of my intimacy in a marital sense, and yet there's another relationship on the outside, that's going to detract. It's going to pull away from intimacy with her. If I turn any of my attention to that relationship, I have to divert some energy and some passion from her to that. And so wholeheartedness is saying, no, there's one relationship, there's one primary narrative. And when I think about it in a relational sense, it means that I'm going to go all in on having deep intimacy, trust, and a level of vulnerability with that relationship.
So, Sean, I mean, we're talking a lot about narrative. And narrative, you defined it, right? Can you define
the story you live your life by? Yeah.
Okay. And your narrative starts from your family of origin?
I think you get most of your narrative from your family origin. What you believe about the world comes from your family origin is the starting place, and it'll get shaped as your life goes on, as you know. But yes, the biggest driver of your narrative is your family of origin.
Okay. So if I'm sitting here thinking my narrative is skewed,
yes,
I want to hone it in differently. What kind of a journey is that?
That's a great question. So that maybe has some complexity, but
yeah,
you and I have spent time in recovery communities, and I think I'll tell you what it's not before I tell you, before to point a direction out there. It cannot be done in isolation. And so if you've been married, you find, and you have been, and so have I, what happens when you come into marriage is that you bring two family of origin stories together, and all of a sudden you find out that those two stories are quite different, and they have different beliefs. It may be about anything from what food you eat to how you discipline, and what raising kids look like. That there's so many nuanced differences to that. So there's that starting point of, there's a recognition that there is a narrative that has an influence on you, but it's not. So you couldn't get to that understanding about yourself in isolation. It was when you got married and you started living with this person that all of a sudden you recognized, oh, there's a difference. And then that causes you to ask the question, hey, what narrative do I want to live by?
Yeah.
And I like something that Scalzo talks about. And so it's all of us have he says, you have Jesus in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones.
Yeah.
And what he means by that is that you're exactly what you said, your family of origin, your grandparents probably have so much to do with the story that you're living your life by, that it will shake you when you start really recognizing that. But he talks about something that he calls, what we want to do in the Christian space is that we want to adopt new family of Jesus values. And that means that there's only one narrative that is that is truly without error, that has truth so tightly connected to it. And that's the story that God gives us. And I think about that as like, I like something John Eldridge, he wrote a book called Epic, and it's like, and this epic is God's story of all of time. And he gave this overall story, and each of us has a little mini story inside that great epic.
Yeah.
And so it's a great way to think about this.
Yeah.
But when we start comparing our story to the story that God says is the real story, the true story, then that helps us to get to alignment. But we can't do that by ourselves. When we can do some of that work, that comparison work. But then I think some of the best tools of that, and I think you and I found that in recovery, is that as we started listening to other people's stories and we started sharing in community, and we recognized that and started sharing the faults and the deficiencies of our story, and they shared their faults and deficiencies, we're able to do this examination by listening to story and then adjusting our lives, saying, hey, I relate to that. My family story, and it may have been a story of emotional abuse. You know, or maybe your family, you yell at each other all the time in ways that are, or maybe it's a family story of sarcasm, you know, where, hey, we're always sarcastic to each other, and sarcasm being the, you know, maybe the purest form of truth in one sense, we're always cutting each other to the core with sarcasm. And once you see that happening in somebody else's story, and you recognize, oh, that's happening in my family story too. And I didn't even realize that was a problem until now. And then you had the opportunity to say, hey, I want to rewrite my story going forward. And the way you start that is, that was wrong. And you confess. And then you go to the people that you've been sarcastic to, and you say, hey, I found something in my story that I've been hurting you with. Will you forgive me? Because I've hurt you with my sarcasm, and it was wrong. And now that I see it, I actually don't want to live that way anymore. Will you forgive me? And maybe we can grow in depth of relationship.
Yeah, that's good. Doing an honest inventory, I know for me, was a life-changing exercise.
Yes.
You know, there were things that I did and things that I thought were part of a normal narrative. Come to find out, they were actually character defects and destructive to me and others. And it wasn't until I got into recovery and doing step studies and being sponsored and all that my narrative was shaped within the halls of recovery. And like you said, listening to other people's story. It wasn't done in isolation. I wouldn't know how. I mean, it required community for me. And the thing I love about recovery is it's safe community. The guidelines make it safe. So it's loving. It's loving and kind.
I think if you get to a realization that nobody has a perfect narrative, it helps too. Like, we're all in this boat together. It's like, I don't have a perfectly honed, accurate narrative. It's easier to say, hey, all of us are living some form of false narrative. We don't fully know. But if we start pursuing truth and we recognize that others help us identify, you can use the Word of God. God's narrative helps us identify where our narrative is off and aligning there. And then we start looking at other people's stories, and we recognize, hey, they have something in their narrative that is really valuable that I learned differently, that is off, that doesn't.
Sean, is a narrative, you know, like there's worldviews out there, and it answers questions like, you know, what is a human being? What's right and wrong? Those kind of, like, what happens after death? Worldviews.
Those are all part of the narrative. Yes.
That's part of the narrative.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. How you think about disciplining kids is a part of your narrative. It's like, hey, a kid needs this. You know, one might be they need to be loved all the time and a lot of affection, and another might be, hey, they need a good beating. You know, and then there's something in between. It's like, hey, they both need love and some level of discipline, and that's physical. And others maybe, no, they only need. And so these are all constructs of about a narrative. And usually it's, well, how did our family handle discipline? Tells me what I think is right or wrong about discipline.
Right.
It doesn't make it right or wrong. It just tells me what I think about it. And how did my family think about what is life after death? What was I taught when I was growing up? It's your starting point. It'll probably change through time.
Yeah.
But those were that was that starting point. It's like, what's the biggest influence? Well, you start out largely having a narrative that was the one given to you by your family. And then it starts being adjusted.
So bring me back as we close this out to how this relates to being single-minded and wholehearted.
Right. And so the reason why we were talking about this and the concept of narrative is we talked about competing narratives. There's a level of insanity sometimes that we live in. And I used the example of my own life as I recognized that I was living my life and I was pointing towards things on the outside that I thought were really important. And I was at the same time wondering, why am I feeling dryness and disconnect from God? And it was because my dual-mindedness had me with two focuses. I was pursuing some level of trying to cover for these inner feelings of disappointment or lack of connection by trying to get connection in a place that was outside. But that competes with the narrative of, if my meaning and significance comes from God, why am I not single-mindedly focused in pursuing that? And when we thought about the cancer journey, it's just this idea that cancer is a focusing force. To ask you, hey, what's really important?
Right.
And are you single-minded? And are you focused on where you're going to find real peace and real significance?
Yeah.
And I believe it is.
Yes.
And so this is an opportunity. And then there's the question of how. So we threw a few tools in there. It's not a complete toolkit, but we threw a few tools or ways of examining, hey, am I single-minded or am I dual-minded? What does it look like? And where does it come from? But I think the invitation on this episode is just to take some time to think about, hey, how has cancer put some focus and clarity in your heart and mind? And where are you in that sense of a spiritual or moral inventory of what's your narrative? Are you set, and do you know what your single point of wholeheartedness is pointed at, or are you duplistic? And then work off of that, because I think peace comes when we really know what's deeply important and know that our lives are matching, our walk matches our talk.
Right.
And that becomes a place of much greater peace.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. It's good. Good stuff.
Well, and enjoy just interacting on a little bit. I know it might have felt a little bit.
I'm going to try to wear different clothes.
Oh, are you?
Maybe. We'll see.
That
I might
goes
keep
against
the same
your
ones.
narrative of minimalist. I think is big. I think it's great.
I'm a minimalist.
Yeah. It's like, well, why not be a minimalist? I mean, why do you need to change who you are?
I mean, I don't have to pay much attention to things around me because I'm a minimalist.
You don't have to think about what you're going to put on in the morning if you're a minimalist.
I'm a minimalist.
Although I'm going to talk about can I put something duplistic out here?
Sure.
You have two vehicles, and a minimalist cannot have two vehicles.
Yeah.
But a single guy with two vehicles is not a minimalist. So there's a bit of
I have the car for my kids. But yeah, I know what you're saying.
So I'm going to attack that a little bit, but just for the fun of it. We're good friends. But I love we can talk about these concepts. It's a lot of fun sometimes when you start thinking about life and how it plays out in our own narratives.
Yeah. Thanks, Sean.
So thanks for letting us share, and we'll see you on the next episode, and we appreciate y'all.
Yep. Thank you. Blessings.